All right, it's official. After this last video, you are second year sociology students, and you all have finished this 100 level course. So congratulations. And depending on those third test scores, I think you all are going to pass pretty well too. So I'm looking forward to that as well. Hopefully everybody's got their homework in. All right, let's go ahead and end with the social construction of race. I said it over and over again in the last several videos that race is a construct. It is created. So what does this actually mean? It means that race grows. You see it says grows out of the process of human interaction. And race is what is interacting. Humans is what interacting humans define it to be. We can go over and over and over again. But I think the part that you already understand is that most social sciences argue that race is a social construct because it is different time to time and place to place. Racial differences are human creations rather than eternal or essential categories. We know, as we've seen that through colonialism and our own U.S. history, that the definition of race has definitely changed, or the separation of people has changed based on that race. How do social scientists approach and explain this idea? Because race is socially constructed, it is not a fundamental category of analysis. It's not real, and we make it real because we study it. As sociologists, we shift it and we make it real. So that is the first way. So this is how social scientists approach and explain the social construct, and it's in these three ways. No fundamental category of analysis. So there literally is nothing fundamental category of analysis. This idea that there's really nothing to study. You can study Black people, but they're all over the world. So you're not going to get any sort of answers that are the same. Does that make sense? If you are studying Black people in France versus Black people in America, there's going to be grave differences, including maybe how much their skin color actually creates the differences. So right off the bat, the only thing that makes race real is us analyzing it. Number two, when we view racial differences, like in academic achievement or crime or SAT scores, if we view them as if they are truly racial, yet without the attention to social dynamics that produce these differences, we reproduce discrepancies and inequality. And I will go ahead. It says right there, means that racial differences produce discrepancies. Let's talk standardized testing since they brought up the SAT. If you are raised in an affluent white home, you will hear more of the words and the vocabulary that is used on the SAT. Does that mean the SAT is racist? Or has the racial differences that we have decided are in our society actually created this bias test? If the powers that be separate themselves between the haves and have-nots and use racial markers as the way to divide some of those haves and have-nots, then of course they would create a test that would benefit them, that sounds like the way they talk, that reads the way they read, etc. It doesn't necessarily mean that the test, as of any test, is just racist. If we go and take a standardized test in another country, it might not have any linguistic differences from the majority of people that live there, or all of the people that live there. So the point is that racial differences actually produce these discrepancies. As soon as we start to say there's a difference between Black people and white people, we produce a test that then has those discrepancies already in it, has that race already created within it. So number three, once that race is created, and this is the important part, That race, as any other social category, is constructed, but it is a social reality that after race is created, it produces real effects on the actors who have been racialized as Black or Hispanic or Asian or white. It's important to know that this category is unstable. So that's at number 3. Once race is created, it produces a social reality and racialized others. We live in this social reality of race. I am white. You are Hispanic or Latino or Mexican. We don't have any Black children, I don't think, in our class, unless I'm forgetting about somebody. I think we have an Asian. I believe she's Vietnamese. Is there any difference, though, in all reality, to who we are and how we are unless we actually add that racial construct in there? For instance, are Nee and Jessica basically the same? Young high school girls, study hard, do good jobs on their schoolwork. I think they both play tennis. You both play tennis? We could say you guys are the exact same kind of person until, of course, we put in the one difference that we have created as a society that we say matters, right? Okay, so how does the socially constructed category produce real race effects? 3 ways that this socially constructed category produces real race effects. Here they are. Through the idea of racial structure, when race emerged in human history, it formed a social structure. Again, this idea of privileged Europeans over non-Europeans. Of course, this is the beginning of that systemic privilege. Once that was created, we have this racialized social system or white supremacy. It becomes a global and affects all societies where white Europeans had reached. So again, when we start to take a look at that colonialization, white Europeans or Christopher Columbus and the Spanish traveling the world and seeing different races, then you start to see that us and them mentality jump in there. And here we go, the definition of a racial structure. You will need this for the test as well. The totality of social relations and practices that reinforce white privilege. This is the definition of a racial structure, the totality of the social relations and practices that reinforce white privilege. We're going to talk about white privilege again. Again, this is not about white people being racist. This is not about white people being rich. And it has a whole other sense. And if you read The Invisible Knapsack, and the article that is attached to that, then you get this concept. Our job as sociologists is to uncover the particular social, economic, political, social control, and ideological mechanisms responsible for the reproduction of racial privilege in our society. Here's a question. If we know that race is not a real category and it is in fact a social construction, then why does race as a meaningful category still exist? White people receive material benefits from the racial order. Whites struggle or passively work to maintain their manifold, many various privileges, right? Again, those people in power continue to make the system for their benefit. And as a result, those without privilege struggle to change the status quo. This is the secret. Racial social structures exist because they benefit the members of the dominant group. Race is more of a reflection of status, inequality of rank, and creates unspoken guidelines for daily interactions. Again, you have that short answer. This is not necessarily a part of it on the test that talks about why we should why race isn't real, but this definitely is a part of it, right? It just is a reflection of these things and not necessarily a reflection of biological trait. Do you remember reading the white privilege article? That's really what this whole section is, this whole slide is about. It becomes really important for us to understand the idea of racial identity. And I think you guys, as people of color, can easily understand your own racial identity. However, typically when white students experience discrimination or racism of some sort, it feels more like a guilt trip and less of an opportunity to learn. And again, we're going to go from that back door of the white perspective and this idea that most white people tend to not think of themselves in racial terms, right? You may call yourself Hispanic, but I don't walk around going, I'm so white, having certain privilege. But um, the whiteness in of itself has little meaning to me as an individual who is white, just in general. And this goes for the majority of white people. That race only exists in relation to another. So right off the bat, if I'm surrounded by a bunch of white people, I really don't notice my whiteness. Um, Whiteness is meaningless in the absence of blackness. So there's this idea out there that you can't have a yes without a no, pain without pleasure, fear without whatever the opposite of fear is. There is no white unless there is something that's not white. And the converse is true. There is no black unless there is something deemed different than that. Race itself would be meaningless if it were not a fault line along which power, prestige, and respect are distributed. And again, when we look at where power lies and where those social class systems divide, we see that power, prestige, and respect have a lot to do with it. It's funny that if we look along this fault line, we could see how a vast majority of Americans who are people of color are definitely on one side of the line, and um, white people are on the other. However, I feel like if we keep looking farther down this fault line, we think about the rap music industry. Obviously, Eminem being one of the few white rappers had a harder time breaking into an industry that was traditionally for people of color. Here's another example of that social construct. During the Vietnam War, North Vietnamese did not distinguish between Black Americans and white ones, since both seemed equally powerful with an M19 in their hands. It can take the social construct just right out of it real quick when we have either a common enemy. For a significant chunk of white folks, the inability to get race and to understand why it figures into our lives so much for people of color stems from this deep affliction of rugged individualism. And that if you want to make it in America, if you want that American dream, we've already talked about this, if you want that American dream, it is up to you to pull yourself up to do so. Again, that would suggest that everybody has the same starting point and everybody has the same life chances, and we discussed what life chances were. It is a kind of a delusional belief that we are individuals first and foremost, captains of our own ship, so on and so forth. This is solely different than many of the Hispanic backgrounds that you come from, where it is not it is not an individual society, but actually a we society. You can see this especially in a lot of Latin nations where the individual does not take credit. It is a we all did it. You see this a lot, I think, with new ELIS students who are just learning the language, especially. They come together, they help each other out, they bring each other across the finish line. And there is no, well, I just did it by myself because I had the desire to do that. Now, that still exists, obviously. Does being white mean never having to think about it or recognize it? Basically, yes. If we can take a look at the invisible knapsack, it gives us a really good example that yes, race is a part of being white. However, white is not necessarily a race that anybody who is white recognizes as a race, right? And I'm not saying that people walk around going, white's not a race. But it simply means that if you're white, you don't have to think about it. You don't have to think about being white. Nobody ever sat me down and said, okay, Kris, if you're driving at night and a cop pulls you over, make sure your hands are out the window. Make sure you don't piss them off. Don't want to get thrown to the ground. This never happened to me. So that's kind of the bottom line. And if we get into the invisible knapsack, then if you read that, then you get to start to understand this concept from a white perspective. It is not about, I know I have privilege, so I'm walking around using it. It's about, I don't know that that privilege exists, period. I have an unearned skin privilege that I have actually been conditioned to be oblivious about. Just like I didn't choose my color, an African American does not choose their color. Yet the reality is that we live in a place where our society is comprised of a variety of racial and ethnic groups. And in this country, people see that. And that becomes the basis of the categorization and subsequent inequality. So, plain and simple, this is simply the reality. I don't see myself as an oppressor, as a white person. I don't consider myself unfairly advantaged or that I have been participating in damaging the culture. Um, I have always thought that I personally have worked to create a more equal, or at least stop the social injustice of systemic racism. And that is how I've always looked at racism, as something that needed to be fixed, something that puts others at a disadvantage. And while I've been able to see race and racial injustice, it has been taught to me to not see the one main aspect of race, which is white privilege, right? Um, it's kind of that idea of you can't have one without the other. So again, I can't have white without black. I can't have white privilege. I can't have racial systems, racist systems and structures if I don't have its opposite, which is white privilege. Okay, why should we want to end racial privilege? We could talk about the moral reasons. We can talk about how this hurts people of color. We can talk about how it creates a status system where some believe they are better than others. But I'm going to actually, again, turn this on its head and come at it from the back door. And let's see if we can understand a little bit better about why racial privilege, white privilege, is actually hurting white America. And I'll just say it. The price white people are paying to stay one step ahead of everyone else is actually costing a lot. But let's get into the labor market and let's say, from a white privilege perspective, why would we want to end that? And here's why. Because discrimination holds down most of the wages and living standards. Now that sounds like it might be a good thing, right? It keeps working people divided, and although it creates this surplus in the labor pool of quote unquote others that employees will turn to when the labor markets get tight. So the benefit of racial discrimination in the relative sense is good in the labor market, but in absolute terms, it actually does not help our market. Again, I will explain that discrimination holds down most of our wages and living standards by keeping working people divided and creating a surplus labor pool that employees turn to when the labor gets tight. It keeps the labor market down, right? Our wages stay low, our living standards stay low. Here's one way you can think about the labor market. If the labor market is a balloon and we put a weight at the bottom of it, that weight at the bottom of it is that discrimination piece. Like we're the lowest of the low, right? Where that weight is, we're gonna put the majority of the weight there. We're gonna put the weight of stress, the weight of discrimination, the weight of not making the best wages and not living in the best areas. That weight will pull down the entire balloon, or that discrimination will pull down the entire labor market. All right, let's talk education. White people do benefit in education in terms of, receiving better resources and better class offerings. But there's two things that come up here. One is that the creation and perpetuation of a miseducated person of color harms us all, right? If we are not offering the same resources and the same class offerings and the same teachers and the same books, then and the same education, if we're not offering that to our students of color and we are to our white students, it's going to hurt us all. Those students of color are going to grow up to be a part of our society, and if they're uneducated, that will hurt us all. The second reason is if the people who are in power continue to write the story, to continue to put themselves in power, or to continue to create the story about them being in power, then we're all getting a miseducation. And as a history teacher, I specifically run to this one to say, hey, if I have never learned about people of color in our history, if I didn't know that our history actually included a whole other side to it than Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas and the British showed up and took over, the British showed up and had all this new land, that is not the story, that is the truth. And so if we're miseducating our students with untrue education, with lies about what actually took place in history, or about what things should look like or should be based on white America, then we are actually creating an entire education system that is flawed. Okay, last, we've got the justice system. Uneven treatment in the justice system has its blowback on the white community. We think little of the racist growth of the prison industry and how the prison complex is actually getting bigger and bigger. And sure, there is a moral reason right there to end that, but it is also rational in the sense that the prisons are warehousing Black and brown bodies, continuing to warehouse and create that prison industrial growth. Unfortunately, they're doing it with the same dollars that I want for my classroom, or that we need for building colleges, or that we need for building, safe roads. We can see that if we're putting in, and we talk about this all the time in the preschool to prison pipeline, we can see that if we're putting in the dollars on the back end to imprison them and not putting those dollars in on the front end to teach, then we are actually creating this system that is screwing everyone out of these tax dollars that are needed. Can you think of others? Can you think of other ways that white privilege is actually creating a system that hurts white America? All right, let's just go ahead and wrap her up. In conclusion, the key point: race only exists in relation to one another. Race would itself be meaningless if it were not a fault line along which power, prestige, and respect are distributed. Ethnicity determines culture. Race determines social position. As a white person, I don't feel privileged. I did not choose this skin. However, acknowledgement is not enough. Action is necessary. Why would we want to end it? Those are your answers there. I think she actually just added this slide at the end here. Let me just go ahead and, as she did, make sure I touch on any important information that you might need, seeing as how there will be no study time for the test. Again, make sure you know that definition of ethnicity, the subpopulation of individuals, reveals or perceived to reveal historical and cultural experiences. Know that race is not the notion of a genetically isolated group. Okay, that's not what, right? We said this over and over again. This has nothing to do with genetics, has nothing to do with biology. Race has nothing to do with any the genetic isolation of a group. It is not all Black people. Because again, we run into those blurred lines and that foggy definition, right, of racial construct. Essentialization, so essential is important, right? Essentialization is when a negative generalization or stereotype is regarded by society as inherent to the character of any person identified by that stereotype. So this probably should have been in the last lecture, but what it says is that essentialization is when you take that stereotype and you create it as not just a stereotype for that race or for that group of people, but as an actual inherent thing. So, Asians are smart. It's inherent. They come out of the womb and they're just smarter than everybody else. There you go. That is a stereotype which actually becomes an inherent part of the character of that person, right? Just make sure you know that one. I got that in your notes there. Race is not biologically determined, but we do have those racialized social systems that exist. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. You are finished with Sociology 101 as soon as you finish these notes and take your final exam any time tomorrow or Friday. So good luck. Congratulations. You made it to the end. And I love you very much. And good luck on your test. Holler if you have any questions.